So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth or you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. So the way it works is raise interest rates, tighten money, reduce the balance sheet, et cetera, get unemployment up. It doesn't sound like a desirable goal, but that's what it takes. And that's what happened in 1982. Get unemployment high enough so people are buying hamburger instead of steak. They're buying, whatever's the least expensive thing on the shelf, day old bread instead of new bread, or they're not buying gasoline because they're not going to work, et cetera. That will bring prices down, but at a very high cost, which we just talked about, which is high unemployment and lower productivity. Meanwhile, the US debt keeps going up. We haven't really talked about the debt. That part of it looks like 1981. But if you throw in a global financial crisis, then it starts to look more like 2008. Yeah, well, that's like a glacier. Glaciers are extremely powerful, but they move extremely slowly. There's some exceptions, but they kind of like, an inch a year, a couple inches a year, but they move mountains. I mean, they create rivers, they create canyons, they move mountains. They're extremely powerful, but slow. That's a good metaphor for the impact of debt. And when I talk about debt, in particular with the United States, but you can apply this to any country, I focus on the debt to GDP ratio, because you can't really talk about debt in isolation without thinking about the capacity to pay the debt. And a simple example, if you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card and you're making $30,000 a year and trying to pay rent in New York, et cetera, good luck. You're probably going to go bankrupt or at least default on that card. But if you owe $50,000 on your credit card, but you're making $5 million a year, it's, you just write a check. It's no big deal. My point is, you can't look at a $50,000 debt and decide if it's a problem or not unless you compare it to the income. And if it's too low, it's a problem. And if the income's high, not a problem. So that's why you use the debt to GDP ratio. The US just hit $31 trillion in national debt. That is national debt, almost all of it in the form of US Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly US Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? Well, one way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt is making millions. No big deal. 30% is comfortable. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. If you say, what's the critical threshold where, water turns to steam, or, water turns to ice, or something changes in such a way that it's not the same. It's radically different, but it happens very quickly. The best research says the answer is 90%. And this comes out of, Ken Rogoff at Harvard, also Carmen Reinhart, who's now the chief economist at the World Bank. But they've looked at hundreds of cases over hundreds of years. And I like that because it's not just, kind of cherry picking data. Developed economies, developing economies, economies that issue debt in their own currencies, ones that issue debt in other currencies, principally US dollars, et cetera. So, a wide variety of case studies. And they show that when your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, your multiplier of additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely, that's a big condition. But you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. But that $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, roughly, You borrow a dollar and you spend a dollar and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth or you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York. She says it doesn't matter. That they always point to Japan. Japan is at 280%, way past any member of the peer group. China's probably higher. China's a little more opaque because they are, but also they don't have as much national debt. If you look at the national debt to GDP, it's modest, but they have an enormous amount of provincial debt, and the banking system is owned by the government or controlled by the government. So when you throw in the bank debt, the state-owned enterprises, the provincial debt, and the government, so that's the real national debt. Stephanie Kelton says it doesn't matter because you're borrowing in your own currency. So if you're Argentine and you borrow in dollars and you print pesos, how are you going to pay the dollars back unless you have huge trade surpluses, which they don't? So they just default. Argentina is a serial defaulter, and everyone expects that. If you borrow in dollars and you print dollars, which the United States does, they're like, what's the problem? Just print the dollars and pay the money back. Well, that's true. If you print dollars, there's no reason to default on dollar debt because you actually can print the money and buy the bonds. But it doesn't mean nothing else bad happens. What about inflation or hyperinflation? What about the foreign exchange rate? The exchange rate can collapse. And these modern monetary theorists show very little understanding of the international aspects. They treat the US like a closed economy, which it's not. I mean, if it were a closed economy and we didn't have to worry about trade deficits, trade surpluses, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, China owning $1 trillion of US Treasury securities, which they do. If you didn't have to worry about any of that, I think they'd probably still be wrong, but they'd have a better case. But you do. And they're just not very knowledgeable about any of those things. But you can think of exchange rates as a conveyor belt. Exchange rates are one way the problems go from one country to another, or good things can go from one country to another, depending on whether exchange rate is going up or down, the impact on terms of trade, et cetera. But they completely ignore all that. They also ignore the role of commercial banks. They just look at the Treasury and the Fed and look at money supply, but like kind of M0, but don't understand how commercial banks create M1 and they do their own thing. They're not on as short a leash as they seem to think. But if you read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, she says, well, we don't really need a bond market, U.S. bond market. We only have a bond market as a favor to investors because it gives them a place to put their money. But why have, he said, you have government spending. So the Treasury borrows money by issuing bonds, and then the Fed monetizes the bonds by buying the bonds, and that gives the Treasury the money to pay the bills, et cetera. She says, do away with all that. Just give the Fed, wire instructions for Lockheed. And if you need 5 F-35 fighter jets, order them and just send the money right to Lockheed. Why do you need a bond market? I mean, she actually says that. So, okay, legally, that might be possible, but to suggest that you can do that without consequences is nonsense. And then you say, what about inflation? Their view is as long as there's excess capacity and unmet needs, et cetera, you're not going to have inflation because there's a lot of slack in the economy. Well, that's a legitimate debate. But they say when inflation happens, raise taxes. And then, by the way, they also say you don't need a tax system because if you can just print the money, why do you have to collect taxes? And their answer is, we collect taxes to redistribute income. Okay, well, at least they're honest. I mean, that's kind of a socialist model, but they're honest about it. But it's important to bear in mind that Stephanie was the principal economic advisor to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. And Bernie Sanders today is the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, controls the purse strings. So coming out of Congress, and Biden's kind of a cipher. He's barely aware of his own existence. So Sanders is in a powerful position, and she's she's the Bernie whisperer, so to speak, who's behind all this. So if you ask the typical member of Congress, can you define modern monetary theory? They'll look at you funny. They've either never heard of it or they certainly don't know what it means, MMT, you know. But they're acting in accordance with modern monetary theory. Whether they know it or not doesn't matter. The actual behavior of the Congress, and again, just go back to COVID 2020, because we talked about the debt to GDP ratio. So in around May or June 2020, Trump put through a $2 trillion COVID relief package, and that was when, you know, the Paycheck Protection Plan, that was $800 billion, and everyone got the $1,200 check, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of December, at the very end of the Trump administration, they did another $1 trillion, almost. And that's when everyone got the $600 checks. And now you're up to $1,800. By the way, those checks, that is helicopter money. That's, you know, what the Fed does is kind of nonsense. But when it's fiscal policy, not monetary policy, and you're handing out checks, that is helicopter money. And credit to Larry Summers for saying, you're going to get inflation out of this. Well, Biden comes into office in January 2021, and he's like, not to be outdone, he did his own COVID relief package. That was another $2 trillion. And that's when we all got the $1,400 checks. They handed them out. And then later that year, they did the $1 trillion infrastructure package. And then just to top it off, what did we get recently was the just under $1 trillion Green New Deal. I call it the Green New Scam. Well, and the baseline budget deficit, before everything I just described, the baseline budget deficit was about $1 trillion a year. So take $1 trillion for 2020, 2021, and 2022, add on, you know, $2 trillion for Trump's first package, $1 trillion for his second one, $2 trillion for Biden's first package, $1 trillion for the Green New Scam, and I think $1 trillion for infrastructure. That's $7 trillion on top of the $2 trillion baseline budget deficit. So that's $9 trillion piled on top of what was at the time about a $21 trillion national debt. So that's how we got to 30 trillion. That's how the ratio went from 106 to 131. These numbers are mind-boggling, and MMT says doesn't matter. But it does matter, and it shows up the way I described earlier, which is it slows growth. You don't get growth. So best case for the U.S. is very slow, weak growth, which we saw from 2009 to 2019. Worst case is you throw a recession on top of that, which we're heading for, and the U.S. will be in fiscal distress. But a global recession is highly unusual, and that appears to be what we're heading for. So my forecast, you know, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were 0. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. You know, believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it. Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. But the definition of the terminal rate is it's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, it's gone from, in the U.S., it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%, and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, so here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So my expectation is the Fed will raise interest rates 50 basis points on February 1st, and then probably 25 basis points in March. March 22nd is the Fed meeting after that. So those 75 plus the 450 we have now, that'll get you to 5.25. And even the more hawkish members think that that's probably the terminal rate. So, so Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid 2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question, so that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up and, people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side. But by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down on its own, will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. There were $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. These are mortgages that, no documentation, don't have to prove your income, very non-credit worthy. But there was a bubble mentality, a frenzy, and everyone, hey, buy a house and borrow money, fix it up, sell it for twice as much, walk away rich, and everybody was doing it. Mortgage default rates rarely get above 5%. 5% is really high in the mortgage market. So people were saying, smart people like Ben Stein, the financial analyst, but the central bank and others were like, well, okay, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate, which has never happened, but just assume that's true. On $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, a 20% default rate would be a $200 billion loss, which was only slightly higher than the S&L crisis of the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, it would have been a comparable loss. And the attitude was, well, we survived the 80s, we'll survive this. Yeah, it's bad, banks will take losses, stock prices go down a little bit, but we'll survive. What they missed is, yes, there was $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives.
Yep.
That was invisible. So all of a sudden, 20% of that was $1.2 trillion. So you create derivatives out of thin air,
Yep.
And there's no limit on how many you can have. They're off balance sheet, meaning give me the balance sheet of the company, I won't see them. You have to read the footnotes and then the information behind the footnotes. So non-transparent, unregulated, no limit on size. So the crisis was actually much worse than anyone realized. And then when it started to collapse, the contagion spread throughout the financial system. My point about 2008, it was because we did not learn the lessons of 1998, and we flew right into 2008. But once again, we have not learned the lessons of 2008, and we're going to fly right into the next storm. In 1998, Wall Street got together and bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, the point is each crisis is bigger than the one before. The intervention gets elevated, larger dollar amounts. And are we now at the point where there's no one left to bail us out? And one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, okay, Jim, I kind of follow your analysis on how risk works and how complexity theory and capital markets, how that works. But where's the crisis coming from? What's going to be the catalyst? It's actually a long list. Now, student loans, there are $1.6 trillion worth of student loans. So this will go, and kind of this gets to your point, Francis, how do capital markets and money markets and Fed policy kind of leach into debt and deficits? So when a lender, credit union, or anybody, or university makes a loan to a student, and the Treasury guarantees that loan, which they do, it's off budget. Again, it's not strictly a derivative, but it is non-transparent. So then the student defaults, and the credit union, the lender, simply turns to the Treasury and said, here's your loan file, pay me. And the Treasury pays the lender because they've guaranteed the loan. Now it's on the Treasury. But until that point, that loss is not on the books of the United States government. That loss is not part of the deficit. But when the Treasury writes the check to make good on the guarantee, it does go into the deficit. So we think deficits are high now, but there's this $1 trillion tsunami of student loan losses that's going to pile on top of the structural deficits and make it even worse. So all these things are, I spend all my time analyzing these things. I see them all. I can describe them. I can see how they're going to converge into a worse crisis. But in the short run, people either ignore them or they just don't know anything about them. But why would Bernie Sanders even suggest that? And by the way, he's not alone. I think the other candidates have, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, one way or another, have suggested that they would do something similar, that we need student loan relief, and that ends up going onto the budget and onto the taxpayers. But there's a school of economics, and I talk about this in Chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York, but she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. Yep. That ratio is over 100%. We have round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me. It troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%, 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. If you go to the Ginza, you know, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you know, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin. I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary, and this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, you know, I don't know what's going on here. I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. It doesn't. And so, you know, I'll buy gold, I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources, buy a new car, buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There, as I say, land, real estate, and natural resources. They're all good. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory. This is about the most indebted period in the history of the world. I never thought I would see so much debt so quickly as we have seen in the last few months. So what we're really talking about is government debt, because no one expects governments to go bankrupt, although we all know that occasionally they do default. We've seen many cases of that, but certainly not the United States or the UK or Spain or France. No one expects any of those countries to default anytime soon. But the way I think about debt is I use the debt to GDP ratio, because debt is not automatically a problem. It may be a problem or it may not be a problem. It all depends on how much income or output you have to service the debt. So just to give a simple example, let's say you have a credit card and you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card. You owe the bank $50,000. Is that a problem? Well, if you make $20,000, it's a big problem. You're probably going to go bankrupt. But if you make $200,000, you could probably, write a check and pay it off. So the answer as to whether the debt is a problem or not can only be thought about in relation to your income. And so I use the debt to GDP ratio. I say, how much debt does a country have? How much debt is outstanding? And how big is their GDP? And when you use that ratio, if you're at, say, 30% or even 40%, that's a comfortable ratio. Yes, you have some debt, but you also have, say, a strong economy and your ability to service the debt by collecting taxes or other sources of revenue is very reasonable, and that debt level is sustainable. But when you get up to 60%, 60% happens to be the level under the Maastricht Treaty where the members of the European Union are not supposed to have debt in excess of 60% of their GDP. Now, many of them do. I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but that's where Angela Merkel gets a little bit upset when you're above 60%. And Spain and France and some other, Italy certainly are above that threshold. But there's another threshold that's important, which is 90%. And 90% comes out of the research of Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. And what they've shown in developing markets, developed markets throughout the 20th century, recently, in the distant past, no matter where they look, once a country gets above 90% debt to GDP, a couple things happen. Number one, debt is no longer productive. The idea of borrowing is I'll borrow $1.
Dude, I'm going to do something with that money. Huh?
Yeah, I'll borrow the $1, I'll spend the $1, but I'll get $1.20 of GDP because, I'll spend it on something, but then the recipient, he'll spend it, and then someone else will spend it. And by what's called velocity, or the turnover of money, you'll actually get more than you borrow. That's Keynesian economics, very simplified version of it. But what Rogoff and Reinhart have shown is once you get past 90%, that's no longer true. You borrow $1 and you spend $1, but you might only get 90 cents or 80 cents of GDP. In other words, you reach a point where you cannot borrow your way out of debt. You cannot borrow your way to get enough productivity to get out of debt. And then you're sort of in a doom loop or a death spiral. Well, I mentioned 30% is comfortable, 60% is a problem in Europe, 90% is this critical threshold. The United States today is at 106%. But we are very rapidly moving to 120%. When you take the additional $5 trillion of new deficit spending that the Congress has approved and put that on top, and bear in mind, the GDP has gone down, right? So your denominator is shrinking, your numerator is going up, which means the fraction is going up, and now the debt is well in excess of 100%. It's actually coming into 120%. So all of a sudden, the United States starts to look like Italy, or for that matter, Lebanon or Japan, which is the highest of all. Now, the modern monetary theorists, MMT, modern monetary theory, whom I completely disagree with. I know a lot of them. I know Stephanie Kelton. She's a big brain. She's one of the thought leaders. She has a new book coming out. They say, so what? They say it doesn't matter. That you can take your debt to GDP ratio to not only 100%, but 200%, or in theory, even 300%. It just doesn't matter for two reasons. Number one, you can always print the money to pay off the debt. By the way, everything I'm talking about does not apply if you're borrowing in a different currency. If you're Argentina and you print pesos, but you're borrowing in dollars, that's a problem because you can't print dollars. But of course, the United States can print dollars. The ECB can print euros. Bank of Japan can print yen. And if that's the currency of your debt, just print up the money. What's the problem? And they have other solutions. If inflation starts to take off, just raise taxes. I'm not so sure about that. You borrow yourself into oblivion, you get inflation, and you think you can tax your way out of it. That doesn't sound like a very good way to go. But the bottom line is that all the countries, starting with the United States, but all the major developed countries, are now in these sky high and rising debt to GDP ratios. Now, the question is, what's going to happen next? Interest rates are extremely low. The central banks have made them low. So the debt service is not that great. The debt is huge. But if you're only paying, a fraction of 1%, it's not as if you're incurring a lot of interest expense, which of course adds to the deficit. So that's the first thing. We don't have inflation. People who say that, the money printing that the central banks are doing to buy the debt, which they are, is inflationary. That's not true. That's a kind of gross misunderstanding, comes out of Milton Friedman, et cetera. It's not true. What does cause inflation is velocity, which is the turnover of money. People lose confidence in money, and they spend it, and someone else gets it and they spend it. Everyone's spending it because they want to run into hard assets, land, gold, silver, fine art, real estate, et cetera. or just buy a car because they think the price is going up, or a refrigerator, whatever it is. If you get that kind of velocity, inflation can happen very quickly. And we saw this in the late 1970s. So the real warning is not that any of these countries are going to default on their debt. They're not going to default on their debt because they can print the money. The danger is inflation. Now, if you said, do I see inflation right now? Absolutely not. We're going to see deflation, which is a different kind of danger. Deflation causes debt defaults because
Japan has been trapped into that like for 30 years.
Yeah, and Japan's been in a depression, in my view, since 1990. My view, the U.S. has been in a depression since 2007. We're in our second lost decade. Japan's entering their fourth lost decade. But it's as if all the countries in the world are getting more and more like Japan. I had a meeting with Saki Kibara-san. He was very famous in the 1980s. He was known as Mr. Yen. He was an assistant finance minister in Japan, but he was called Mr. Yen. But very smart guy, very nice guy. And I confronted him on this. I said, Saki Kibara-san, your debt keeps going up and your debt to GDP ratio is sky high and your GDP is kind of flat. And he said, yes, but you're missing one thing. He said, our population is going down, which is true. So on an overall basis, they're flat, but on a per capita basis, their GDP is actually outperforming. So I said, so the logic of that is that someday there'll be one person left in Japan and she will own the entire country and be the richest person in the world. Well, it's very bad for Argentina, and here's why. If you, or Chile for that matter, if you borrow in dollars and then we have deflation, what does that mean? It means the value of cash is going up, but it also means the value of the debt is going up. So even if you have very low interest rates, which we do, when you borrow in dollars and the dollar is worth more, that's what deflation is. Your dollar is worth more. That means your debt is also worth more, meaning you owe more debt in real terms. The nominal debt's the same. So if you borrow 100 million, you owe 100 million. That doesn't change. But if you have deflation, so that the 100 million is actually more valuable. See, people, this hasn't happened since the 1930s. People don't understand. No one alive has really lived through a strong deflationary period. A lot of us have experience with inflation. We had it in the United States in the late 70s, and you're right, Argentina's had it on multiple occasions, and we can name other countries. People have a sense of what to do in inflation, but no one alive has experienced serious deflation since the 1930s. And if you did, you're 95 years old today. So people don't really understand it. But one of the things it does, it makes the real value of debt go up. So in real terms, you owe more money. So if you were in trouble to begin with and you borrowed money to get out of trouble, but the value of the debt goes up, now you owe more money. Now where do you stand? It may not show up in interest payments, but every dollar becomes more and more difficult to get. The dollar's worth more. So what it means is that you see a strong dollar. Now, your local currency could be weaker against the dollar. That's true. That could help exports. It could help tourism. So,
there's no tourism right now. There's not going to be more tourism.
Well, you make a good point. There is no tourism today. I'm on a mountain, and you're in a home or studio or someplace. So right, there's no tourism going on today. But assuming it comes back next year, if you have a really strong dollar, in theory, an American could, or European for that matter, could look at Argentina. I've been to Argentina many times. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and nice people, great restaurants. So, but it could look kind of like a bargain to somebody with a very strong currency.
Sure.
But that's not really Argentina's problem. Argentina needs more high-tech industry, more high-value-added industry. It needs to break out of what's called the middle income trap, where you get to a certain point, but you can't get past that point because you can't just do it with assembly-style manufacturing jobs. You need high-value-added jobs. You need technology is what you need. And all the developed economies are facing the same issue.
That applies to all Latin America, Chile, Mexico, Colombia.
Correct, but it applies to most of Asia as well. This is China's problem. China's not going to continue the kind of growth we've seen over the last 20 years because they've used up that. When I studied development economics in the 1970s in graduate school, and we used to think that the hard part of development economics was getting from low income to middle income. And then we say, if you get to middle income, it's a straight path to high income. Turns out that's not true. Getting from low income to middle income is actually pretty straightforward. You have to get rid of corruption, and you need to ease up on regulation. But you can, if you have foreign direct investment and people come from the country to the cities, and you do, kind of simple manufacturing, et cetera, you can get a really good export machine going and earn hard currency reserves. So that part's easy. The hard part is getting from middle income to high income, because it turns out you can't just do more of the same. You actually need more high value added. You need technology today, and that's what I would advise every country to be working on, including Argentina, where the Argentina has a very highly educated workforce. I mean, Argentina would be a good case to why don't we make iPhones in Argentina instead of China, and we're going to bust up. The United States is going to bust up the supply chain to China. We're going to shut over time. Won't happen overnight, but we're going to pull those factories out or shut them down and move them elsewhere. So the question is, if I were advising any developing economy, I would say, how can I become a supplier to the United States? If they're going to get rid of China, which we are for a lot of reasons, I'd want to be in the list. And we're actually looking at Jordan as a country that could make cell phones. India is a big case because they have cheap labor. Argentina, I think, is a better candidate because they have a more highly educated workforce. The U.S. and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans. Mm-hmm. China was buying all their soybeans from the United States just as a way to kind of make it up a little bit. Like, well, we got to buy the soybeans anyway. Why not buy them from the U.S. to keep the U.S.-China trade deficit under control so it doesn't become too politically toxic? Well, as soon as Trump threw on the tariffs, China retaliated by moving their soybean orders to Brazil. Stop buying U.S. soybeans. Well, that's not a phone call. I mean, you're talking about vessels, port facilities, agriculture, trucks. How do you get the soybeans to the ports? How many do you grow? Where's the fertilizer coming from? Et cetera, et cetera. And all those parties, the shippers, the cargo, the insurance companies, and there's so many people involved, banks, letters of credit, it's just a lot involved. They don't like short-term relationships. They say, okay, I'll do it. I want a 5-year contract. And China said, okay. So they reconfigured all those transportation lanes to get the soybeans from Brazil. All of a sudden, you're a U.S. soybean grower. You say, well, what do? Well, we started selling them to the Netherlands because the Netherlands needs soybeans too. So now instead of shipping them from like Port of LA to Ningbo and near Shanghai, we're shipping them from Port of Houston to, I don't know, France, or Marseille or someplace, or Rotterdam. So the point being, you completely scrambled all these supply chain relationships. I talked to the guy who, look, this is a worldwide endeavor, but he was probably the single most responsible individual for all the significant developments in the supply chain in the last 30 years. And he said to me, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build it. We blew it up in 3 years. It's not going to come back overnight. It's going to take 10 years or more to rebuild it. And what I talk about in the book is supply chain 1.0, which is 1989 to 2019, and then supply chain 2.0, which kind of starts now, but is going to go indefinitely because it's going to take a long time to put this together. It's it's like dropping a vase and it breaks in 1,000 pieces. You can't put it back together. You got to go buy a new vase. And that's what's going on with the supply chain. There will be a supply chain, there always is, but the new supply chain will look very different from what we've just come through. Because the whole 30 years of period I'm describing was built on efficiency, lower cost, lower cost, lower cost. It was kind of the Walmart model. So yeah, just-in-time inventory, everyone knows about that, but there's something called cross-stocking. That's where a truck pulls up at a warehouse and you unload it. Instead of putting the stuff in the warehouse, you move it to another truck that then goes to a destination. The stuff never goes in the warehouse. Inventories are very expensive. They're costly to finance. You got to move the stuff around. It's called picking. Pick the stuff off the shelf with your. I used to drive a forklift, so I know a little bit about it. And put it on a truck. I used to unload trucks too. So hey, I've got 7 suppliers. Why don't I cut it down to 3 and do bigger contracts with each one and get lower unit costs? I've got 5 transportation lanes. Why don't I cut that down to 2? Get everything to Los Angeles and Seattle, as the case may be, et cetera. And they did it for 3, and they got costs lower, and Walmart and Amazon were the champions of this, but everyone else was doing it. But they missed something. What they missed was that while they were getting those unit costs lower for consumers, there were hidden costs, and the main hidden cost was you were creating greater frailty. This whole system was subject to a massive breakdown. So, what happens if you have two suppliers and they both go on strike? What happens if you have one port of entry and it's backlogged? What happens if you've got cross docking in warehouses and there aren't enough trucks? There are 80,000. We need 80,000 drivers. 80,000 drivers. Wish they'd hire them instead of these IRS agents. But the point being, it is breaking down all across the board. Now, can it be put back together? Yes, but the biggest difference between 2.0 and 1.0. This goes by different names. Janet Yellen called it friendshoring, and Macron called it a constellation of nations club, if you will. So you'll still have trading partners, you'll still have outsourcing, you'll still have transportation lanes, but it'll be members only. It'll be basically democratic, kind of liberal republics, Western Europe, the EU, of course, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India, we expect to be included. Friendly nations, but China's out. We're decoupling from them. They're decoupling from us. This isn't US driven. The US is participating, but this is what China wants too. Both sides are decoupling as fast as they can. China can develop its own network, maybe Central Asian republics, some Southeast Asian suppliers and so forth, but they're going to lose customers. Well, most of their customers actually in the United States. We won't buy their stuff and we won't sell them our stuff, particularly high-tech stuff. So the world's going to break, and these new clubs are going to be formed, and there will be trade and there will be transportation lanes, but it'll be much more restrictive. Now, will prices be a little higher? Yes, but it'll be more secure. So the way I describe that, if you buy insurance on your house, or I buy insurance on my house, you don't want your house to burn down. You hope it doesn't. But if it does, you don't think your insurance premiums are a waste of money. Like when you write that check, you're like, that's money well spent. When you pay higher prices for consumer goods, the delta between the old price and the new price is your insurance premium for a more reliable system. And also, there's a big national security component to this. And I talk about Russia and Ukraine and China in the book. So that's all. So the how the supply, what the supply chain breakdown means. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, what caused it, and we talked about that. And 3, where is it going? What are the constraints? And we talked about that. But then my editor, who's love working with us, she said, "Well, Jim, got to be a chapter on inflation." I said, "Of course we do. The supply chain breakdown is causing a lot of the inflation we see, and I'm going to write another chapter on deflation." And everyone's like, wait a second, why are you talking about deflation? That's coming next. People are not ready for it. I know the inflation's here. I buy gasoline. I shop in the grocery store. I get it. It's persistent. It's not transitory. I understand all that. But inflation has two major sources. One is the supply side, which is called cost push inflation. So that's energy price shocks, the stuff we're seeing coming out of Ukraine, fertilizer shortages, strategic metal shortages, component suppliers who can't deliver stuff to factories in Germany and they're shutting down, et cetera. The other cause is from the demand side, and that's called demand pull inflation. Basically, it's psychological. Consumers pull demand forward. They're like, hey, I was thinking of buying a refrigerator. I better buy it today because the price is going to go up in 6 months. And in the 70s, we had both. It started with cost push with the Arab oil embargo, but it ended up demand pull. I was starting my career at the time. Your boss would just give you a raise. You didn't even have to ask. Inflation was going up so fast. Like, I better give this guy a raise. Like, here's another, $30,000 or whatever, because people would quit. And that sort of spun out of control until Volcker squashed it all. Right now, we do not have demand pull inflation. We don't. This is not what's going on. We do have cost push inflation. The difference is hugely important because cost push inflation from the supply side, which is, again, when I talk about in the book, it's real, prices go up, but it's self-negating. The old saying that, the cure for higher oil prices is higher oil prices, because when they get too high, people stop driving. They shut down various activities. By the way, if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gasoline because you're not going anywhere. I mean, that's kind of a nasty way of putting it, but that's how cost push inflation, tips into a recession, and then prices come down. And we saw that in 1974. You had Jerry Ford and Alan Greenspan walking around with they had these win buttons, WIN, which stood for whip inflation now. except we had a recession and prices collapsed. Now it came back by 77 with for a lot of reasons, but right now we don't have demand pull, we have cost push. It will go away when this economy goes into recession, and then we're going to be talking about disinflation and deflation, which are kind of close cousins. And the Fed's going to be out on a limb as usual, raising rates in the face of a recession and a price collapse. We're seeing something globally we've never seen before. And it is the best single indicator of a recession. The last time we saw anything like this was 2007, just ahead of the 2008 financial catastrophe. So the stock market's saying it's all good, Goldilocks, soft landing, Fed's going to get the memo, they're going to cut rates, the pivot, and buy stocks. The bond market is saying, no, this is bad and it's going to get worse, and it's actually too late for the Fed to do anything about it. But what happens is, as you get closer to the actual thing you're worried about, the inversion gets nearer and nearer. Now it is literally a month away or less. So that's like a big red siren, flashing light, whatever you want to call it. Interest rates are a lagging indicator. Everyone's like, well, how could interest rates going up if we're in a recession? The answer is, as you get closer to recession, who figures it out first? Well, the Fed figures it out last. They're usually the last to know. Wall Street is second last to know. The people who figure it out first are actual business people, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, dry cleaners, taxi drivers, or even medium-sized businesses. They see it. If you're in the trucking business, it's real time. Inventories are sky high and new orders are being slashed. You're not moving anything by truck. A lot of business people are living in the real world in real time. They know what's happening now, and the stock market tends to figure it out later. But as far as banking and credit is concerned, what happens is, if you're a business person and you see business heading down, fewer customers, whatever, you go out and borrow all you can. You're like, hey, there's a really bad recession coming. If I got lines of credit, I'm going to use them up now. I don't want my bank changing the terms. I don't want material adverse average change clauses kicking in. Instead, I'm going to borrow everything I can. And that creates a demand for funds, and interest rates go up. And then the recession hits and the bankers go, what's going on? Credit losses start going up. And then they just turn off the spigots and they raise standards. They stop doing loans. And then interest rates will start to come down. But interest rates peak after the recession has already begun. So stock market's telling us Goldilocks, bond market's telling us, here comes, Hurricane Mitch or whatever. And then there's what I call the reality. What I see is a kind of a hybrid. The Fed's doing what they're doing, right or wrong. Okay, they're doing what they're doing. The market has their own interpretation. I agree with the market, certainly the bond market, that the Fed has probably over-tightened. They're going to keep going for the reasons I explained. That means they're going to make it worse. They're going to make the recession even worse. And they may pivot to say that there could be a rate cut. It won't be in April, but rate cut in August, maybe. I wouldn't rule that out, but for a really bad reason. In other words, if the Fed cuts rates, which they may, the pivot may be real. It's not because they engineered a soft landing and Goldilocks and everything. Oh, it's just right. It's because they screwed up as usual, as they've been doing since 1913. They over-tightened. They didn't look at the forward indicators I described, and they found out too late. Then they have to slam on the brakes, or take the foot off the brake, if you will, in terms of rate hikes, and then pivot. And we've seen this movie before. This is exactly what happened in 2018. I mean, I don't know. Attention spans seem to be short these days, but it wasn't that long ago. Go back and look at a chart, any stock index chart from October 1st, 2018 to December 24th, 2018, less than 3 months. The stock market dropped 20%. I mean, it's like 19.9 or something on the Dow, so maybe not technically a bear market, but yeah, what's the difference? It dropped 20%, culminating in the Christmas Eve massacre, December 24th, 2018, when it dropped, I think NASDAQ dropped like 3% in one day. Now, here's the point. The Fed was tightening into that collapse. The Fed tightened on December 16th, 2018, only like 8 days before the Christmas Eve massacre, and after most of the 20% collapse had already happened. they tightened one last time. So what it shows you is that when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market. This whole, Bernanke put and Greenspan put and all that. That's not how it works. They don't care that much about the stock market level. Here's what they do care about. They care about disorderly markets, and that's the key word. It's not if stocks are going down, but it's kind of a little, 0.5% a day, 1% a day, trending down, lower highs, lower lows, trending down. The Fed doesn't care about that. They're not going to bail out the stock market. They do care if it's disorderly. When was it disorderly? Well, March 2020, at the worst part of the pandemic, it dropped like 30% in like 2 or 3 weeks. The fall of 2008, it was like somebody opened a trap door. The Fed does care about that because that kind of disorderly behavior can feed on itself and end up in a 1929 type scenario. So the Fed will get the memo, as I put it, stop raising rates and begin cuts when the markets are disorderly, but not just because they're going down. So there may be a pivot, in late August, or July thereabouts, but not because of Goldilocks, but because it's not a soft landing, it's a crash landing.
But real quick, I guess, let's stick on the recession just for 1 second, because there's the, bad recessions generally come along with a lot of job losses. Do you see, given that this recession could be worse than most are expecting right now, there being, wide-scale layoffs of the sort we've seen in some of the bad previous recessions, like '08, like '01?
The answer is yes. First of all, we're seeing it already. So, I don't match the company to the exact number, but layoffs on order of magnitude 10,000 to 20,000 terminated employees at Google, Amazon, Facebook, and other tech names. It affects other sectors as well, but tech in particular has engaged in a massive series of layoffs. And so people go, well, wait a second, how come it hasn't shown up in the unemployment numbers? Because the unemployment rate is it's around 3.5, 3.6 on an exact number. It's right in that neighborhood, 3.5, 3.6. We haven't seen that level of unemployment, that low, that is, since the 1960s. This isn't like, a good year or a good day. This is the lowest since the 1960s. And the Fed is absolutely looking at that. You're right about that, Adam. And they're saying, and of course, they believe in the Phillips curve, which is junk science. But the Phillips curve, for those who are not familiar, says there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So if unemployment is high, inflation is low. And if unemployment comes down, inflation goes up. And so if you want to get inflation down, you should expect to bring unemployment up. That's what the Fed believes. What I just said is nonsense. It's not true. It's junk. But the Fed believes it. Again, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the Fed thinks. So you got to put yourself in their minds to figure it out. So as far as they're concerned, those kind of unemployment numbers, lowest since the 1960s, that's inflationary. They got to get those numbers up. Now, here's what the Fed is missing, or maybe everybody's missing. When you hear these layoff announcements, people are like, well, if they're laying off, why isn't the unemployment rate going up? Unemployment lags the business cycle. Unemployment is a lagging indicator. When you're an employer, entrepreneur, and you're in any kind of distress, not as many customers walking in the door, you'll do everything you can to avoid laying people off. You'll, be late on the rent. You'll turn down the lights. Find a cheaper laundry, whatever it takes. And then by the time you get around to firing people, you run out of options. Like, I've done everything I can. Now my business is in jeopardy. I have to fire some people. So that, and then combine that with what I just said about severance and, rolling terminations, et cetera. It's a lagging indicator. We know enough right now to know that number's going up this spring. But that's not inconsistent with the fact that we're already in a recession. It's exactly what you would expect, that unemployment's a lagging indicator. Now, having said that, what else is the Fed missing? Well, wages are up 5% on an annualized basis, 5.2% on an annualized basis. I'm like, yeah, and inflation's 7% or 6%. So your real wage just went down 1 or 2 points. Because when the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports those wage numbers, those are nominal numbers. I'm not saying they're fake. But you have to know that they're nominal, and you have to subtract inflation to find out what's happening to real wages. And the answer is real wages have been going down for a couple of years because it runs around 5% annualized, give or take. Sounds like a 5% raise. What do you want? Well, yeah, but with 8-9% inflation, or even 6% inflation, your real wage is going down. So that's not a robust number at all. The Fed, by the way, the Fed wants to make it worse. The Fed agrees that those wage gains are too high. But my point is, in real terms, they're actually going down, but the Fed wants them to go down more. That would be one way to put it. If you get inflation down and wages are constant, then the real wage goes up relative to where it was before. But if you're unemployed, you have no wage. So that's another issue. Now, what the Fed is missing, and it's a long list, but there's something called the labor force participation rate. Now, the labor force participation rate, you just take the number of people working divided by the total working age population. It's all you do. It's not sophisticated. And that number today is around 61%, 61.2, give or take percent. But as recently as 2000, that number was over 70%. And has come down ever since. And it dropped like a stone during 2020, during the pandemic lockdown. Came back a little bit, but not much. The reason it got, first of all, it's never 100%. It shouldn't be. There are legitimate reasons to be working age population not working. You're a homemaker. You're a student. You're an early retiree.
Right. You're in the military. Yeah.
You're in the There's a bunch of perfectly good reasons. So it's never 100%, not even close. But 70 is pretty high and 60 is pretty low. And the trend has been down. So that leaves, relative to kind of a normalized number, that leaves about 8 to 10 million people between the ages of 25 and 54 who are not in the workforce. There's a big untapped labor pool. But if you took that group and threw it into the unemployment numbers, the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates it, unemployment would be about 9%. And that's a depression level of unemployment.